This is Decentralized Radio. I'm Tristan.
And I'm Ryan.
The goal of this podcast is to help educate you on how to live your most optimal life. We will host industry expert guests to shed light on topics that matter.
We are not gurus, rather two individuals who have had to pave their own path to health and vitality, independent of the centralized systems that plague modern society.
On today's episode, Ryan and I had the pleasure of sitting down in person with Caitlin Long. Caitlin is a 22-year Wall Street veteran, jumped into the Bitcoin and crypto space by founding Custodia Bank. Custodia is breaking ground on the bridge between the traditional banking system and the Bitcoin and digital assets that exist. We talked a lot about the issues with our current banking system, Bitcoin adoption alongside this banking system, as well as Wyoming and what it's like to live in Wyoming and the importance of decentralization. This was a really great and rewarding conversation to have with Caitlin. I'm excited for you to listen in.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. We are live in Cheyenne. Welcome,
Woohoo!
Caitlin. How's it going?
Welcome to my backyard.
Yeah. So another live conversation in Wyoming. We're on a little road trip here. And you grew up in Wyoming.
I did.
Left and then came back, correct?
Love it. Yep, indeed.
Okay. So maybe for a little introduction, let's go through your backstory. So it's like Wall Street, and you moved east, and then what brought you back to Wyoming, and did you miss it while you were gone?
Oh, yeah.
The whole lot.
Born and raised in Laramie, and Dad was a college professor. Mom was a rural school teacher who drove 40 miles each way to teach at a tiny rural school, often behind snowplows on closed highways. It's a natural wind tunnel, as you probably know, and so Wyoming's a windy place. And I come from hardy stock, as they say. But then, left after college to go out into the big world, and pretty quickly started wearing cowboy boots and realized, my gosh, the place I left was really special, and I knew I'd come back, and got the opportunity to come back in 2019, right before COVID. It was very lucky that we moved here right before COVID because this was a good place to ride out COVID.
Were you in New York City then? Or where
I was in New York. So I started out with 4 years of school in Boston area, and then went off to New York and was there for a total of 25 years. More than that, actually, yeah. So I was in New York. I was on the East Coast for almost 30 years total, and then came back. Yeah.
Quite the contrast, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what was that like? Exciting at first, and then maybe overwhelming towards the end, or what did you think of that?
Well, I always kept one foot in Wyoming. My parents were obviously here for a while. They've both since passed away, but very active as an alum of the University of Wyoming. I spent more than 20 years on boards at the University of Wyoming, the Foundation Board, which is a formal fiduciary role, and then the Board of Visitors of the Arts and Sciences College, which is the college from which I held the degree undergrad. And then just lots of friends, families mostly in Denver. So came back a lot, and always kept close ties here. Always knew I'd come back. I just didn't think I'd come back as soon as I did. I figured it would be retirement, but life throws you curveballs sometimes, and it just made sense to come here. In after the Wyoming Blockchain Coalition stuff started going, one of the things I wanted to do, I was retired. I wasn't really thinking that I was going to start a business, but one of the things I wanted to do after. We'll probably talk about the Wyoming Blockchain Coalition, but it started in 2017, moved back home in 2019. I call this home, even though I moved to Cheyenne. But it's very close to Laramie. I needed to be closer to the airport, which is the reason that we chose Cheyenne. We thought either Cheyenne or Jackson. Jackson's awesome. Love Jackson. Love the vibe. Love the fact that it's a nice connection back to the city folk. Sometimes when I'm in Jackson, I see more people that I know from New York than people I knew from Wyoming, but it's not really Wyoming. And I think you guys know from spending time in small town Wyoming. Small town Wyoming is very special, and it's different than Jackson Hole. That's got its great restaurants. It's got its culture, really interesting people from all over the world. And I appreciate that, but I also really appreciate small town Wyoming because that's where I came from. And especially my mom, having taught at a rural school of town of 300 people. And she had a huge impact on the students there, so much so that they actually erected a monument to her when she passed away. She passed away relatively young. And there is an art installation in her memory in tiny Rock River, Wyoming. She had that much of an impact on that town. And she had those students winning national science contests, national essay contests from tiny Rock River. And she so appreciated the opportunity to be a rural school teacher because she grew up in a teeny tiny town in South Dakota that has since unincorporated because so few people are there. And so she really came from that background. And in part because of that, I had such an appreciation for the New York Cities of the world and the teeny tiny Rock Rivers of the world.
Yeah. So just maybe diving into that a little, like that's kind of like decentralized education there at the small scale. Like how did that kind of shape like the way you think about education? Like, what do you think about that now? Like compared to, these giant public schools in New York City, New Jersey area, any kind of really populated area. Do you think that's a problem?
I'm actually a proud product of Catholic schools, undergrad, or, we're undergrad. I say basically from first grade through sixth grade, and then public school. And it blows a lot of people's minds that I was taught how to shoot a rifle in a public school. We could come back and talk about that later, but this is a hunting culture too, right? And a lot of people, as you know, from spending time in Wyoming, this is how people feed their family. And I do resent the outsiders who look down upon that because everybody has a right to feed their family. And there's an incredible wealth. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about the incredible wealth of the wildlife in Wyoming and the herd management and the conservation that comes from hunting to keep those herds from doing what happened this year. We had an incredible winter kill because there was a harsh winter, but the herds were too big. And in some places there was 90% die-off. And I just lament because I think, I know having worked, we can talk about this later. I'm not answering your question, but to come back, the Governor Gordon's wife, Jenny, is very active in the Wyoming soup kitchen. And I was lucky enough to participate in the Wyoming women's antelope hunt. It was my first hunt of big game. And it was fun to be part of that, where some folks were there to learn the skill, to be able to feed their families. My hunting partner was a mom who was filling her freezer with good grass-fed meat to feed her family. And there were many others who were there to donate their harvest to the soup kitchen. And, that's a wonderful thing. And that's a huge part of this culture. So, but as much as some folks from the city look down upon all that, one of the other fun things about it is when I take them shooting and they understand now what it is. And I see some of my, most liberal friends to take them shooting and watch them see it or watch them experience it and understand that it's a great equalizer. But boy, it blows their mind that I was taught in a public school how to shoot a rifle in 8th grade. Post-Columbine, of course, that's no longer the case, not even in Wyoming, but it's still a hunting culture here.
There was like archery or something. I thought it was actually not real rifles, but mock rifles, maybe in Thermopolis that they were doing. And it made like regional news like that.
Because they're starting to bring it back. Yeah.
So that was like, my sister sent me that because she was still there. And it was like in tri-state area news, which is really funny.
Well, it's interesting because when I was in high school, I remember, first of all, in junior high, some of the students brought their own rifles to the class. Okay. Like that blows most city folks' minds. But even in high school, it was not uncommon for the rifle to be visible in the back window of a pickup truck. And you'd be in the student part of the parking lot of the high school and there were rifles in the pickup trucks because this is just part of the hunting culture. So nowadays that's not so visible, but it was interesting coming back because having been in a city where it's, really only the criminals are carrying the guns and the police officers. To come back to Wyoming and I started to really notice it and appreciate it a lot more than I ever had before. You'd see somebody getting up from a chair in a restaurant and see that little bulge. And, I didn't understand what was there before, but I appreciate the fact, as somebody who's had some interesting, I'm a relatively public person and have had some interesting situations, as you can imagine. I appreciate the fact that at all times there is someone around me, if not myself, who's armed.
No, I mean, I resonated with a lot of what you just said, only because I kind of grew up in a really small town. I'm from Wisconsin, but I grew up in Midland, Kansas, in a town called McPherson, which is like smack dab in the middle of Kansas. It's actually a similar physical size to Thermopolis, but more of a land or like population size now. But when I was there, it was pretty small. They had like one main plant that pretty much everyone in the town worked at, and I like a lot of the same stories that you just said. I saw all that stuff. Like pretty much everyone had guns. Like everyone was shooting. I still talk to friends that are from there and like live around the area still, and like talk about that stuff all the time. And I think what I was just going to say is that you have this really good perspective now, having lived in New York State, in the city, and coming back. So you have sort of this dual perspective that a lot of people that just grew up, say, in cities like Toronto or New York or LA don't have. I lived in LA for a while, so I have sort of that same perspective of different types of mindset. And it's interesting, sort of the closed-mindedness that exists. And it's sort of unfortunate because I feel like there's so much context-dependent stuff. Like, it's totally different environment here than in Los Angeles. And so I hate when people do blanket statements against these sort of like ways of upbringing, like one way is wrong and one way is not. So I'm sure you have that same sort of opinion on that.
Hey, friend. Thanks for listening. If you really enjoy this podcast, it would be really appreciated if you left us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple, or subscribe to our content on YouTube. This helps us get to a larger reach and a larger audience to spread this wonderful free education.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's why, we talk about orange pilling in the Bitcoin world. When some of my most liberal friends, I was a member in Connecticut of a shooting club, and some of my most liberal friends, I'd come and teach them, give them the experience. And everybody had a great time. And they understood how empowering it was, especially for women. It is a great equalizer for people who are of less physical strength, whether it's height, whether it's gender, whether it's just age or muscle tone or whatever. There is a great equalizer that comes with that. So it is what it is. It's not a big deal to me because it just is. And it's interesting because, of course, when I was in New York City, living in New York City, in order to get a permit in New York, you actually had to prove that someone was after you, and basically it was impossible. But once I moved to Connecticut, it was interesting. After my father passed away, there wasn't anybody else in the family who was willing to take the family firearms. And I have one of my most cherished possessions is my grandfather's shotgun that his father gave him when he turned 14. Okay, this came from the Montgomery Ward catalog. They were not wealthy people, but it has some really beautiful tooling on it, and it is a family heirloom. And I am keeping that, and I have actually had it refurbished because I want to pass that on. This was a big thing back then. Now, he grew up on a farm in Iowa. So again, I come from small town, rural people. Both of my parents grew up on farms, and one of the farms in the family is still in the family. It's been consecutively farmed by a Long in Johnson, outside, I think it's Johnson County, Iowa. It's right outside Iowa City, for 132 years. And I only recently really learned about the family history and how we can trace, when the relatives came into the United States and what was their circumstance. I come, by the way, it was my great-great-great-grandfather fought for Napoleon. He was sent at age 14 from Germany, from Bavaria, to fight for Napoleon in Russia. And in that war, there was 90% casualties. The Germans were the ones that were put out front because the French were trained, right? So the Germans were expendable. How my great-great-great-grandfather survived that and there was cannibalism, and it just brutal experience. But for that fluke of history, I wouldn't be here. So it's just interesting to understand your family history. And it was his son who came over to the U.S. And I was able to went back to the family again, some really, really small towns, right? Went back to the family cemetery very recently and found his grave. And I never would have understood the context as a little kid looking at all these. That's the Rarett side. My paternal grandmother, Rarett, Rohret, German name. And I found his grave, and he was an incredibly well-liked, well-appreciated person who lived until he was in his 90s and was a pillar of the community, and immigrated as a little kid from Germany. And apparently they came in through Baltimore and hopped a train. And there's a story that they actually rode on top of the train. And because back then, of course, they were steam engines, and there was a spark that actually caught one of their clothing on fire that came out of the steam engine. So, just the scrappiness of the relatives, I have incredible appreciation for. But, hey, all of us have those stories. I'm not saying that my stories are any different. It's a really interesting mix of city experiences and rural experiences. And I appreciate both sides. And I appreciate people who are open-minded to both sides.
Yeah, I think it's cool when you have that diverse experience. Mine's kind of the opposite, growing up in suburbs of Philadelphia and New Jersey, but then moving out here and just falling in love with like outdoors and nature. And
you have embraced it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That's how we met, is online through Twitter and through some of your experiences that you talk about in Wyoming. I think you love Wyoming as much as I do.
Yeah. I mean, there's not a lot of places, like talk about Europe, where we all our families came from. There's not wild areas that are just untouched anymore. I think it's really special. And we talk about hunting and things like that. I got into hunting last year for the first time ever. Pretty intimidating to just do it. But wow, what an experience to just be in the wilderness.
Well, so many people who look at hunting as and think, oh my gosh, how can you take an animal's life? What's so interesting, one of our neighbors is part of the Game and Fish department, and understanding how that is part of herd conservation. And we were just talking earlier about the 90% die-off in some of the deer and antelope herds in this state because the winter was so severe. Normally the wind blows enough that they can get to the grasses and keep themselves alive during the winters, but because there was literally a snowstorm every Wednesday for about 5 weeks, and it dumped 2 feet at a time, there were some pretty heavy snowpack. It made a great experience for you as a skier, but not a great experience, of course, for the antelope. But what you don't understand is how much because those animals don't have natural predators, and the humans are their predators, and so it is just a normal and accepted part of the experience. And in my first hunting experience, which was the year before last, for big game, one of the local ranchers that I was hunting on his ranch with his wife, and she had worked for the Game and Fish Department in, I believe it was Oregon. It was in the Pacific Northwest. And I asked her, how do you figure out how many tags to give out? How do you try to estimate what is the right herd size? Because she's right. Since the humans have moved out so many of the natural predators, the herds would overproduce and then they would start dying off. And so there is a science to it. And some people would say, well, it's the arrogance of humans that we think we can estimate what's the right herd size. And sure enough, if you want to look at what happened last year, boy, they should have given out a lot more hunting tags last fall, right? Because that winter kill was so staggering in certain parts of the state. And it is sad. I mean, we drove up to Jackson, that area south of Jackson by Pinedale. It was just staggering. It's so sad to see all those beautiful animals right up close to the highway that couldn't dig down to get to the grasses and starve to death. And there were just thousands of carcasses right along the road. And it's just, boy, nature can be brutal. But what the game and fish departments are trying to do is basically estimate what's going to keep the herd going at a high strength. So I've got to tell you also, last year I drew an elk tag and I was ready to do it. And I was waiting, actually, I had applied for a can. And I'm still waiting for the can. That's taken forever because one of the ranchers will not let anyone hunt on his property unless you have a silencer, because it scatters the herd, and it'll scatter the herd 20 miles. He said the elk will literally just run 20 miles. It makes an enormous difference. I've seen now and experienced the difference for hunting purposes of having a silencer. It really does spook the animals less. And of course, one of the things, think about yourselves as a human, when you have a fear reaction, what do you have pulsing through your veins, right? The adrenaline, it has an impact on the meat, right? So I learned this from one of my regenerative farming friends in New Hampshire, who the most important thing when he got one of his chickens was not to scare them because the meat didn't taste as good. You don't want the adrenaline pulsing through, right? So it actually is more humane to do it that way. And but I did not get a chance to get the elk, and I'm so, I'm beside myself because now the elk tags are not as limited as the antelope and deer tags.
No, they did pretty well.
The elk did pretty well, in part because of the National Elk Refuge up by Jackson. There's a pretty decent population of elk, but boy, it's I do lament that I didn't get a chance. My elk tag expired, and so many weekends because I have a friend who's a rancher. He said, "Just come on out here. There's a great herd. I'll help you through it." And the thing about the Wyoming women's antelope hunt that was such a great experience is you were with experienced hunters, and so they did the field dressing. But I said, at this point, that's the next thing for me. I want to really learn how to do the field dressing. And then the next thing after that will be learning how to actually butcher the meat myself. I would like to do that someday.
So I kind of did all that like in one go.
Did you really?
You
went all in.
So,
wow.
Well, I didn't have any rancher friends. So I drew an elk tag, north of Pinedale and north of Cora, like on the Green River, west of the Green River. Beautiful. And I kind of did the math. I was like, where's the best odds I can get first time? That's a beautiful area because worst case, it'll just be fun to look for some elk.
Correct.
No expectations. Had a buddy fly out from New York I went to college with who only had hunted whitetail in his backyard, basically. So no experience either hunting elk on public land in the Rocky Mountains. And we just went out there, no expectations. And, we saw a bunch of elk kind of the first few days and then it tapered off. But then the last day, got very fortunate and harvested a bull after a 400-yard shot. And luckily it was
400 yards. Yeah, wow.
It was the most insane thing. But we hiked 40, 50 miles over 5 days, public land, 8,000 feet of elevation, and then 2.5-3 mile pack out in the pitch black. So,
oh my gosh,
talk about proof
you
of
had
work.
To pack out.
Oh yeah, and it's just two of us, and we had to go back in the next morning, in the dark, down like a little mountainside,
and did a scavenger.
Well, we field dressed it, and that's where my friend was helpful. So he kind of
because he
having done
before.
deer before, that was nice. But it's pretty intuitive, I would say, if you have some, I guess, guidance there. And then we quartered it up and moved all the meat to like 200-300 yards away from the carcass, and then went back the next morning.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm sure that there's grizzly country and there's some wolves out there, but spooky. And so that was what an insane experience. First time ever hunting.
Good for you.
Yeah. And then a week or two later, I was just hunting antelope near Thermopolis and decided to just learn and butcher, field dress, butcher, process the whole thing myself because antelope's smaller and,
there's actually not much meat on an antelope.
No, it's like 40 pounds, maybe 35.
I don't even think it's that much. At least the one that I got, but I must say the one that I got was more for like the experience, and I was able to get in 108 yards.
Nice.
So very close without spooking them, which was great. But then it was so important to me as a first timer to have an ethical kill. because my just ethics tells me I will, if
100%.
I'm going to take a life of an animal, I am going to use every bit of it. I don't hunt for sport. I hunt for eating. And I just was praying for an ethical kill. And it's that hunters, what do they call it? Where you can't pull the trigger. There's something. Yeah, it's basically choking, but it's very real because especially when you're first time trying to do this, it's a very real experience that you end up basically choking and you can't do it. But having done it the first time and being with a hunter and his wife who had nice. Game and fish experience, and it's funny because he nicked the stomach as he was field dressing. And a whole bunch of that part of Wyoming. No, actually, no. That's why I was going to share this. In that part of Wyoming where we were hunting, it happened to be relatively low altitude, and he had alfalfa fields, and so it was bright green. And he said, "Oh, this is going to be good eating," because that was an antelope that was not eating sagebrush, so it won't be very gamey. It was an antelope that was eating alfalfa, and that's indeed, nice. It was good eating.
Yeah, mine was the opposite. First, the elk, I should have 400 yards right in the liver, down, best tasting meat. I actually have a pound. You could have some if you want. But the antelope, I was 70 yards away and did not get it.
Closer.
I was like crawling up, but it was weird, like the way the land was oriented. And then I was like looking at one, and then I was afraid I spooked them. So I actually did not get that one in one shot. And they're only eating sage out there. So very gamey, but that's just how it goes.
Well,
sometimes.
My hunting partner who I mentioned was hunting to fill her freezer, especially when you have one tag, right? And your goal is to feed your family. She wasn't interested in taking a pretty looking one. Yeah. She was interested in taking a big one. And so we passed up several during the day because you only have one opportunity. And when you're trying to fill your freezer, you're looking for a pretty mature big one. And thankfully she found one. But that was a hard experience for me. It was a good experience for me to be there because she didn't get it on the first shot. She wounded it. Yeah. And that is one of the hardest things for especially first time hunters to see and experience. And what the rancher, I was again so grateful to have had that great experience with him. What he explained is that the death of these animals in the wild is so much worse than what was happening with us. Absolutely. And so that helped me understand, especially when, that animal was suffering because she was quite a bit further away looking for a much bigger one that would have been, the one I got was relatively young and, didn't quite know what he was doing yet, even though he had a harem of lots of women around him. He was the equivalent of probably a 15-year-old boy, right? Didn't quite know what he was doing yet, but he had his girls, right? Whereas the one she got knew exactly what he was doing, which is why we weren't able to get as close. But yeah, it was tough for me to watch because, it is hard to see it suffering, but it all happened fast and ethically. And just like me, she wanted every little piece of meat to, put in her freezer and feed her family. So it was as you can tell, a wonderful experience. And the taxidermy, they had set up an amazing taxidermist, and boy, that animal is so regal. And I say thank you to him every time. The first thing I did after I harvested was walk up, put my hands on, and say a prayer and say thank you.
I mean, that I couldn't have put it any better. I come from like a pretty long family history of hunters. I've actually never hunted myself. I've gone on hunting trips with like my uncle and my grandfather many times in northern Michigan. My grandpa owned some land, and we would go almost every season. I think it was whitetail or mule and stuff like that. Or whitetail deer. So we would go to that, and he would always explain to me that you shouldn't. He was really big on the whole like we're going to use the entire animal. Like
correct.
He literally used the hides. He used like the bones for some stuff. And so I had that value really instilled in me.
Right.
And so I find that really valuable. I mean, I'm sure you learned incredible things about yourself on that trip. I mean, I remember Tristan telling me about his experience. And I was like, oh man, I got to get into some of this stuff because it sounds like a wild ride. But I mean, there's sort of like that disconnect. I think that a lot of people have. We talk about this a lot on the podcast about just the disconnect of like the food we eat, where it comes from, and the conditions being completely different in a conventional sense than in a regenerative sense or in a sense of hunting for your food. And so I feel like just having that full knowledge of that connection of like you were there every step of the way with that animal to your dinner table.
You bet.
It adds a depth to it that I think is immeasurable. Yeah. And I think that's super valuable. I feel like it needs to be something that more people need to understand, even if it's just getting to know your local farmer on a regenerative scale, because it's just something that's, I can't express how valuable of knowledge that is for someone to have, because it just doesn't exist in mainstream consensus. Like if you live in a city, like people just go to Whole Foods or something like that, and
they don't know where their food came from. And I mean, I know what you guys are interested in, and with eating local and, non-GMO, grass-fed, regenerative, everything as natural as possible. And that's awesome. And one of the cool things about Wyoming is its food freedom law, which Representative Tyler Lindholm, who's one of the people who created the Bitcoin laws in Wyoming, not coincidentally, right? He's interested in food freedom and he's interested in Bitcoin. So because of the food freedom law, the meat does not have to be processed at a USDA processor. So we buy all of our beef from a local rancher who harvests locally, and they package it and, call up and they'll deliver it. And it's amazing. And they don't even bother to pay for the organic, because why bother, right? I mean, locally, these cows have never had a roof over their head. They've just been grazing on natural Wyoming grass. I have not done the bison. There is a local farmer who does bison as well. And then when we were up for the Wyoming Women's Antelope Hunt, they actually at the meat processing facility had pork as well. So there was a local harvester, and the family farm in Iowa that's still in the family. It's my dad's first cousin. He was a hog man, and it was pork. Yeah.
No, I think it's the principles align like completely. I mean, it's, don't trust, verify, it's everything. And that's like so powerful. And yeah, we'll have to get you some good bison.
I love it. Yeah. And actually, I think it was Jameson Lopp, who's a Bitcoiner who became a carnivore.
Yeah.
He, or at least hardcore no carb. I don't know if he's 100% carnivore, but he started tweeting about the jerky that he was making. And so I bought one of the, air fryers that dehydrates. And so I'll get some of the cuts of meat from this rancher and just make my own jerky with that. And
some of those odd cuts like cube steak or some
are great for jerky.
Yeah, they're great.
Really great for jerky. Yeah. But what's really funny is coming back to why didn't I use the elk tag that I'm regretting not using? It's because I was so busy in the fall. No, I was so busy because of all the Fed stuff, trying to get the Fed approval, and literally it worked 7 days a week, probably around 18 hours a day. It was that intense. And so I never got the opportunity to actually use that elk tag. And I lamented when I threw it away because it expired, and would have loved to have had that good, grass-fed, non-GMO elk meat.
Pure Wyoming protein.
Yeah. And also another story, a doctor who moved into town, moved from New Jersey. So you've got the New Jersey connection. He moved here because he and his wife, he's ex-military, decided that they wanted to serve their kids nothing other than self-harvested meat. And so that's why they're in Wyoming.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So there'll be more opportunity for elk tags, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, I don't know about this year, but we'll have to see. I mean, the winter kill problem is
I got the same
tragic.
one. That was the only tag I got. Antelope,
fantastic.
deer, I did not. It was all like unsuccessful. I was like,
good for you. Well, and I was too, and I
there's
drew
leftover tags and over the counter that you can get.
Yes. So. Well, and they're limiting the out-of-state tags, so you've got to be a Wyoming resident.
Which is also why I love Wyoming.
Well, because this is the natural bounty that is here, and so they take the take the view, rightfully so, that it's the locals that should get a crack at it. But it was so interesting because I ended up buying. Someone let me borrow their rifle for the Wyoming women's antelope hunt because I had a 30-06, and they said there's no way that you should use that for that because it's too big. You can, but you're better off with a 6.5 Creedmoor. So what did I do? I invested in a 6.5 Creedmoor, but I didn't have any ammunition. And in the ammo shortage, I went around everywhere looking for 6.5 Creedmoor. And I've got to say, I had such respect for the others who were doing the same, because we were all waiting for 6.5 Creedmoor. And again, these are people from all walks of life looking to feed their families, waiting for 6.5 Creedmoor, and none of us overbought because we all knew that if there wasn't ammo for others to be able to go out and use their tags during hunting season, that they might not have fed their families. And so all of us, one box. When it finally came in, one box. And I think there was a limit of 3. But at that time, when we bought the 6.5 Creedmoor, one box, all of us.
Are you interested in 100% grass-fed, grass-finished bison meat? I'm excited to be a partner with Falls Family Ranches. Based in Wyoming, Falls Family Ranches is raising high-quality bison meat the way nature intended. As a native large ruminant of North America, bison is one of the most nutrient-dense foods you can consume. If you're interested in trying out their bison boxes, use code Tristan, TRISTAN 10 for 10% off your first order.
Wow. Yeah. I stuck with the 30-06 because ammo was easier.
Well, you were hunting with bigger.
Yeah.
Did you hunt an antelope with 30-06?
Yeah, I did, because that's all. I only had one rifle. But
well, the 6.5 Creedmoor is awesome for antelope.
No, that's a nice caliber.
Yep.
I mean, don't get me wrong. But all right, this is kind of turning into a hunting podcast, which I'm not mad about. And we're gonna have to talk to more hunting folks, like you said, Ryan Leachman. Definitely.
Yes,
Ryan,
I've never met him, but
we'll have to get him on here.
What a great family to move to Wyoming.
Yeah,
and he's teaching his daughter to hunt already.
I think that's a very decentralized thing, so it's exciting. But getting to why you couldn't hunt. So was it, and your Bitcoin origin story.
Yeah.
So were you already into Bitcoin, and then Wyoming, you saw this stuff happening, or how did this all come to fruition in 2019?
So here's the history. I came across Bitcoin in 2012, started to really dig in 2013. So by most people's standards, pretty early. And it was through alternative schools of economic thought. Didn't think Bitcoin had any applicability to mainstream finance. But I was still at Morgan Stanley working, in the belly of the beast of the mainstream financial system until 2016. And then I realized I had to be full-time. I was orange pilled and started to see how this distributed ledger technology, not necessarily Bitcoin, was going to have a big impact on the way the mainstream financial system worked. And also that these two financial systems needed to be able to coexist. There needed to be bridges between the two that where the way that the bridges worked didn't harm the other system, either or. Exactly. So very quietly, I donated appreciated Bitcoin in 2017 to fund an endowment for female engineers at my undergraduate alma mater in my dad's memory. He was an engineering professor. And I started out in engineering, and I'm a failed engineer. I didn't stay and finish. And I thought, why don't I try to help solve the problem of women in the STEM field with appreciated Bitcoin? And I ran smack dab into Wyoming not having had a money transmitter law that allowed the Bitcoin companies to stay. So I didn't even realize that Coinbase had left Wyoming in 2015 because the money transmitter law basically said you've got to hold dollar for dollar reserves in addition to the value of the Bitcoin that you're transmitting on behalf of customers. Well, that makes no economic sense. So they left. Coinbase and Circle left. So when I learned in 2017 that was the case, keep in mind, I had been on the UW Foundation board. I had also been a college Wyoming legislative intern. And so I said, guys, you don't want to miss this Bitcoin thing. I will volunteer to roll up sleeves and help you fix this, because Wyoming was one of the 3 states that had bad money transmitter statutes. So long story short, I came out to Wyoming to try to help fix it through a college friend, met another a local accountant here And the three of us kind of just locked arms and just grassrooted the whole thing, gathered a whole bunch of people that we knew, networked to individuals who were influencers within the state, and said, yeah, let's try to fix this money transmitter law. And when it got fixed, that one passed unanimously in both houses. And that was great. And it's funny because this was 2018. So it would have been January 2018. We put out a call to the industry to come to Cheyenne and talk to legislators, help educate. Okay. So we had a lot of people come up from Denver. We had people who flew in. There was one guy who flew in from Asia, and we had a 16-year-old from Newcastle who had their Bitcoin caught up in the Coinbase situation because they couldn't get it out. They didn't get the message from Coinbase that they had to get it out before Coinbase stopped serving Wyoming customers. And so their Bitcoin was stuck. Okay, so you actually had this wide range of people. And there was a Latina grandmother from Cheyenne whose granddaughter drove her to the event, and she was mining Bitcoin at home. Okay, so this was not the normal crowd, was the point. And there were two things I remember from that little educational gathering. One of the most powerful legislators said, I have never seen people coming up from Denver. It's usually our students going to the big city. That struck him. And then another woman, Senator Tara Nethercott, who turned out to be one of the most influential legislators in this area in Wyoming, said, I can't believe how young the faces were and how I didn't see the normal crowd here. She understood there was something different and special about how early this initiative in Wyoming was. And so then I mentioned Tyler Lindholm earlier. He was the legislator who ran all the bills on the floor. Super talented. And he's the guy who got the Wyoming Food Freedom Act done as well. He came back to me after we got the first one done and said, what else can we do? What else can we do? And then he ended up surprising me with a bill to prevent taxation of Bitcoin. And he just did that to kind of see the look on my face. Like, we were all having fun because this was all just a pure grassroots volunteer thing in 2018. And in that year, 5 different laws got passed through the Wyoming legislature. But again, like, we just sat there and called out legislators and said, can we talk to you about this? And there were so many people who showed up. I'm so grateful. Back then, I feel like I got way too much credit because this was a grassroots thing. I understand why in the media world, people want to have a face associated with things. And because I was out there doing the podcasts, it turned out to be me, but I cannot spread the credit for this across enough people. There were dozens who made this happen. This wasn't one person by any stretch. And so now we're up to 33 bills, I think, that have passed the Wyoming legislature in 6 different legislative sessions to basically recognize this technology, create a regulatory guardrail for it. If this had been taken nationally, what the Wyoming regime for digital assets, FTX would not have happened. Okay, the reason why Sam Bankman-Fried was able to scam everybody was because he was able to skirt around and walk right into a regulatory vacuum. And Wyoming was trying to make all of that regulatory, a property rights respecting regulatory regime go mainstream. Yeah. And it didn't happen fast enough.
And he's vegan, so what are you going to do?
There you go. Well, allegedly, right?
Allegedly.
Now there's all these rumors that he was actually not a vegan at all. So,
well, my respect for him goes up a little in that case. But no, I kind of want to, I feel like we've been doing like Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure with time travel the last like little bit here. But I kind of want to go a little bit further back because most of my knowledge, granted very little, I know more about the sort of standard banking system. I sort of want to talk about a little bit about that and why what you're doing now is super important because of the pitfalls in our current system. And like back in the 30s, obviously, Great Depression had that huge stock market crash in 29, I believe. And then I believe it was the FDIC came out in 1933.
Correct.
And so that was like the safety net, right? The FDIC.
Yep.
And so recently we've sort of had like the Silicon Valley Bank and like a couple other banks have all these issues that you would think would not happen. But I'd like to sort of talk about maybe the difference between the issues that were going on when the stock market crashed, like back then, compared to the bank issues now. Because there's sort of like this idea, or I mean, I sort of want to talk about like, so I have notes here.
Yeah.
Fractional reserve banking.
Yeah.
And sort of the issues with that, because it's like your money isn't your money because your money's not all in the bank.
Correct.
Sort of idea. And so I'd sort of love to talk about some of the pitfalls in that, but I sort of want to do some of that history lesson back in the 30s to now, and sort of like all these problems that have been sort of been building up since the 30s.
Yeah.
And sort of how we got to where we are now, and why Bitcoin is even more important, I think, than ever before.
Yeah. Well, let me go back to the founding of the U.S. States were the chartering authorities for banks. Banks, of course, have been around since human existence. And in the U.S. case, the states were the chartering authorities until 1863, when the National Bank Act was passed and they created a federal chartering authority. But the deal that got cut back in Lincoln's time was that the federal chartering authority and the 50 state chartering authorities were equal. There weren't 50 states back then, but that was the deal that was cut between the federal government and the states. And that deal has been in place and has been respected by Washington up until about 10 years ago. So fast forward from 1863, when you created this, what's called dual banking system between the feds and the states. Then the Federal Reserve gets created in 1913. A lot of folks would say things started going haywire then, and they're not wrong. And then the Great Depression occurs, arguably because of Federal Reserve policy in the Roaring 20s. But they were dealing with the after effects of World War I. A lot of people don't know, by the way, there was a Great Depression of 1920 that lasted 9 months. It was as deep as the Great Depression of after that started with the stock market crash in 1929. Why did that one last 7-8 years? Because the government got in and tried to do something about it. Why did the one in 1920 last 9 months and nobody talks about it? Because literally markets were left to do their own correcting. And it was the lack of government intervention that allowed it, unemployment and GDP to return to the pre-depression levels in 9 months. Okay, so not enough people know about the history of that. It's an incredible piece of history that tells you if markets are left to work, they work pretty quickly. It's brutal, but they work pretty quickly. Whereas it was the attempt to counteract the Great Depression that caused it to last 7 or 8 years. Okay, so then, as you said, the FDIC got created in 1933 as the insurance company. Okay, so 3 important dates: 1863, National Bank Act; 1913, Federal Reserve gets created; 1933, FDIC gets created. Then we had this relative stasis in the banking industry all the way up until about 10 years ago. I mean, we certainly had booms and busts, okay, and that was monetary policy related. We can talk about that in a separate thread, but you asked about the banking system. Okay, about 10 years ago, the bank regulators in Washington, D.C. started to do something they'd never done before, which is starting to pressure the banking industry not to service certain industries that they didn't like. It started with the payday lenders, okay, and the payday lenders may or may not have been ethical, okay, but they were lawful. And then it went to, adult entertainment and firearms manufacturing and gaming and all the sort of sin industries, if you will. And it hit 30 different industries before Congress got wind of it and said, cut it out. You don't have the power as a federal bank regulator to tell a bank which industries it can't serve, and stop politicizing the banking industry. You are an unelected official, and the power that was granted to you to regulate the banks had something to do with whether the banks were solvent and people could actually get their money back, not whether the bank was being used to socially engineer things you do or do not like, right? So it stopped under the Trump administration, and unfortunately it started again. And it started, unfortunately, this time in it's called Operation Choke Point. That Operation Choke Point started in 2013, stopped in 2017. It's back, and it started with the crypto companies, digital asset companies this time, and it's now moving to financial technology companies. So back to your question: what's wrong with fractional reserve banking? What's wrong with the banking system? If you think about the post-depression movie "It's a Wonderful Life," the whole concept of where's your money when all the depositors come to the bank? Well, it's in his house, and it's in his business, and it's in her house. All of that is true. So fundamentally, traditional banking model is built on a grand confidence game. It's built on the assumption that not everybody will come and withdraw their deposits at the same time. And that has enabled the banks to do what's called borrowing short and lending long. Borrow short term, lend long term. They're doing what's called maturity transformation. And when they do that, it's fundamentally unstable. Now, if we were starting to create a financial system from scratch, we would create something far more stable than what I just described, because you can see periodically that when a panic occurs in a fundamentally unstable system, there are bank runs and people lose money. There's a sort of proverbial sword of Damocles hanging over every bank, always. This is not new. This has been the case since the 1930s. And yet, I think a lot of folks woke up with Silicon Valley Bank and understood, wait a minute, my deposits in the bank are not guaranteed. And what's the real counterparty credit risk in my bank? And is my bank even solvent? Wait a minute, I didn't even think I had to do that analysis. In my experience, having worked with corporate treasurers in my Wall Street experience, for them, $250,000 of FDIC insurance is nothing. So they had whole teams of people doing counterparty credit risk analysis on their banks. Because a corporate treasurer, think about the worst case scenario for a corporate treasurer, it's their bank defaults on their corporate cash. That's the first thing that a corporate treasurer would lose their job over. So, of course, they had teams of people. The largest corporations in the world have teams of people who do nothing but analyze the counterparty credit risk of their banks. However, the vast majority of the rest of us didn't even think about it and didn't fully understand it, didn't fully grasp that a bank deposit is fundamentally an IOU to a leveraged counterparty.
Yeah, I think, and at least what I saw from that was just even further consolidation, centralization of the banking industry. Everyone moving their accounts to Chase, but
unfortunately, it's going from small banks to big banks, and that is sad. Yeah,
but the whole FDIC thing, I mean, in general, like how real is even the FDIC insurance policy? Like, and what have you experienced as, obviously getting into your specific situation with Custodia, why, that was barring you from getting this master account, I believe, right?
Well, Custodia did apply for FDIC insurance and was rebuffed. We knew all along that was likely to be the case because the FDIC was pretty anti the technology innovation. And it's more than just crypto. I would actually say that the federal bank regulators in Washington, D.C. have been afraid of technology that speeds up the settlement of transactions across the board. It's not just crypto. It's also just API-based, modern online banking, right? Because that speeds up the ability for people to withdraw their money. Think about the It's a Wonderful Life scene. Everybody had to go down to the bank and wait in line, and fill out a form with handwriting. Whereas now it's a click of your phone. Online banking speeds up.
It takes like a couple weeks to settle. They got more time to figure out, shuffle around.
But fundamentally, I retweeted somebody today who said, listen, the banking systems, the IT systems of the traditional banks are built for an analog world. And that is 100% right. Okay. And so at first, it's interesting because when in January 3rd of this year, the three federal banking agencies, the Fed, the FDIC, and the OCC, the Federal Chartering Authority, put out a joint statement saying crypto is basically banned in all but substance, in all but saying that. They said it's risky, okay? But that's saying it's risky is code to a bank that you're going to have regulators up the wazoo if you bother to touch this industry, okay? This is how the Operation Choke Point 1.0 occurred. It's risky to service a firearms dealer or risky to service a payday lender, okay? That's code for you can't do it. And so what they did in January was put out a statement that said that banks have to be aware of the risks of using open, permissionless, open, decentralized, and or permissionless networks. And I read that and I thought, because I've worked with the folks here, they're smart people, but they don't understand the technology, okay? And when I read that, I thought, that's just lawyers who don't understand the technology making a mistake. Open, public, and or open, decentralized, and or permissionless networks. the internet is an open, public, and or decentralized network. So were they telling, at the time I thought they just made a mistake, but because what they meant was open, decentralized, and or permissionless blockchains. I thought that's what they meant. But now I'm not so sure. After Silicon Valley Bank, you look back at it and look at that January 3rd statement again and realize they're basically telling the banks, don't use the internet. Don't use online banking. Okay, so what they, I think, are pushing, and by the way, they've kind of pushed out some of the most tech-forward banks and had the few that have survived are now under incredible pressure and under consent orders for this, that, and the other thing right there. The regulators are basically saying to the banks, don't be tech-forward. So think about the implications of that. They're trying to push everybody back to an analog world. Have you guys ever set foot in a bank branch? Have you ever written a paper check? Okay, this is where they're trying to push everybody back to the analog world because that's how the systems are built. They're not able to take the internet speed where a transaction can settle as fast as the speed of light. Pretty darn close to it in reality. Okay, so wow, their old systems are horse and buggy, and there are transactions settling with a Ferrari engine. But you got to marry those two. Okay, that's where I spend a lot of time thinking hard about making sure that the fast settling technologies didn't cause bank runs. And if you go back to 2020, I started warning the bank regulators publicly that stablecoins, because they settle so fast, if a bank is going to hold reserves for a stablecoin, that bank is more susceptible to bank runs. And unfortunately, we saw that. Now, that stablecoins were not what actually triggered the failure of the banks that failed in March of this year, in April, actually. But it wasn't that far off. It was the speed of technology and the speed of information traveling, of everyone saying, oh my gosh, my bank might not be solvent. And how fast they were able, through online banking, to direct the withdrawal of their entire account balance. Now, the settlement of those transactions is still on that old horse and buggy back end, but the user experience looks Ferrari front end to the user. And so we got problems fundamentally in this banking industry, right? And the bank regulators are reacting by putting their head in the sand. Federal bank regulators, not the state regulators. My experience is the state regulators are much more open to all of this and very thoughtful, much more thoughtful than the federal regulators. Federal regulators, thumb their nose at the state regulators and think the state regulators are a bunch of hillbilly idiots. However, in my experience, it's actually been the opposite. The federal regulators are the arrogant ones who have not spent the time to learn the technology, and they don't understand that by doing what they're doing, which is shoving all of the new technologies into the corner, they're shoving them into the shadows and offshore. As a result, they're going to be playing whack-a-mole, and it will have been their fault. They made a mistake in not saying, how do we figure out how to make this technology integrate well with the traditional system? And they didn't work with the friendlies. Custodia was a friendly. They didn't work with the friendlies who were.
Is that a what? That was?
Well, it's their choice. Look what they did, right? They denied us, disparaged us. It's their choice. They were the ones who created the fight. Custodia did not seek a fight at all and went to extraordinary lengths to avoid it.
Yeah. So I want to get to Custodia, but if there is a bank that wants to do it a better way, is there even a path forward? Say an average regional bank, maybe not lending out, $10 for every $1 they carry a better reserve and try and update systems, but then they might not get backed by FDIC or. Well,
it's interesting. There's a big incumbent bias in Washington, D.C. And I must say, there are some banks that are far better than others among the traditional banks. You don't ever see me say black and white, all banksters are bad kind of thing. Some of the folks in this digital asset industry will say, I don't do that, because it's not true. I just got an award. There were 20 innovators of the year in the traditional banking industry nominated by the American Banker, which is the traditional paper of record in the traditional banking industry. So clearly they're looking for innovators, and there were some incredible people at this conference doing incredible things. And it was so much fun for me to be there, because all of the politics of the fight were not even part of the part of the discussion. Everybody who was there was interested in doing things in a better way and making the customer experience better and making the bank more compliant through better use of technology. These are all wonderful things. And the people who were awarded alongside me really, truly are innovators and are interested in this. So you won't see me criticizing them. So yes, there are absolutely traditional banks. It tends to be the smaller ones. So now it's funny how this whole conversation started with the whole city-rural thing, urban-rural distinction. There is an urban-rural distinction in the banking world too. The large New York banks do not understand what makes a small community bank tick. The small community bankers have challenges with the technology that they have to keep up with because they don't have full, developers on staff, right? And so finding somebody who can actually bridge those two things, which is what Custodia sought out to do, was that's something that should be embraced. And I will tell you, it's amazing how many traditional bankers have told me behind the scenes, we're rooting for you. And oh my gosh, I wish I could stand up to the regulators the way you're standing up to the feds. And so I'm not alone. This is not a black and white kind of thing. And I got to stop here and thank the board of Custodia, the shareholders of Custodia, and the team at Custodia, who has just weathered some pretty heavy punches that the Fed threw at us. And at the time, I used the phrase, the Fed shot the stallion to scatter the herd. And what's funny is they only wounded the stallion, and we're back. And they didn't kill us. And now that stallion's pretty mad.
That's awesome. Well, congratulations, by the way, on that award, I think.
Thank you.
Obviously, very well justified. But that's something I've been thinking about a lot, and I've transferred to, credit union and things like that. But, then you hear, like Janet Yellen and talking about who's going to be bailed out and who's not. And I think people are more apprehensive about. But I think the people in the small towns of like Wyoming, they're always going to be in like a small local bank. So I guess what is that discrepancy? Is there a concern with the smaller banks? And is that something people just need to trust like more so?
Well, this is the sad part. Watch what the regulators do, not what they say. Okay, the party in control in Washington, D.C. rails against large businesses, but look what's actually happened. The large banks got special deals, and they got special deals to get even bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay, so I feel for the community banks and somebody who's trying to help bring them this new technology that's going to help them be able to compete with the largest players. So look, if the traditional banking system as a whole, that whole business model of taking in a deposit and turning around and making a long-term loan against it, when all those depositors show up and want their deposits back, those banks are not solvent fundamentally. So I just saw today, there was a very thoughtful macro analyst, Mike Shedlock, Mish, came out with a proposal for how to restructure the banking system to make it stable. And, he's got some good ideas. It's basically, as I said before, if we were going to create a banking industry, it wouldn't look like what it does today if we were starting it from scratch. What would you do? You would have the long-term pools of capital, like pension funds. Those would be the ones who make the long-term loans. And you would match fund the duration. The duration is the in plain English, it's the midpoint of the expected cash flows of your investment. Okay, so a mortgage is going to have a 10-year mortgage is give or take going to have a duration of 4 years. It's the midpoint of the expected cash flows. Okay, so a pension fund easily would invest on a 4-year term. In fact, they're looking for longer term stuff than that. Most of my career I was working with life insurance companies and pension funds, which are the longest of the long-term investors in capital markets. Right? So they would be the long-term investors, the long-term lenders, if they could be, but that's not the way that system works. Instead, what we do is we tell them, no, they have to go back, they have to go invest in stocks. They don't try to asset liability match their cash flows. That's the way the pension regulatory structure works. It's called ERISA. The incentive for them is to invest in stocks and roll the dice. Whereas the banks, the incentive is also to roll the dice in a different way, which is to take this borrow short long-term maturity transformation risk, which inherently means there's a sword of Damocles hanging right over them. And if there's ever a rumor that they're insolvent, then all of a sudden, thanks to online banking, their deposits can disappear much faster than anyone anticipated. Except for folks like me who were warning, if a bank's dealing in digital assets, they darn well better hold nothing but cash. And in fact, unfortunately, some hard lessons had to be learned because that wasn't heeded.
I guess my question would be sort of like with so much like going on like in the legislature and just like public reception. I think obviously it's kind of gained more positive since 2020 over the last couple of years because of just everything that's gone on, and even in the last several months because of the bank run stuff. But like, where do you see all of this stuff going? Like the next like couple years, 5 years, 10 years. Like, what's the future look like? I mean, there's that talk about like
great question,
CBDC and all this stuff, but like, where are we going?
Well, there is a very important school of thought that what happened to Custodia, because Custodia has a patent on tokenized bank deposits. And we were the one that got the closest, and we're the one that was the most respectful of the existing legal and regulatory structure of the banking industry, that's the reason why the Fed went after us first. And at the time, we had evidence that there was a coordinated effort to get multiple applicants at the federal bank charter level to withdraw their applications at the same time. We have that in email. So we knew that this whole concept of Operation Choke Point 2.0 was real. There was coordinated effort among federal banking agencies that were supposedly looking at each applicant individually and had due process obligations to each applicant, right? But no, behind the scenes, that went out the window, right? So unfortunately, there's, federal banking agencies, the government used to be there to serve the people, and instead they think we're there to serve them. It does seem. But what has happened subsequently in the next few months is that it became crystal clear there's an all-of-government approach to try to shove the entire crypto industry offshore. And they literally, from what I can see, the policy people, these are not the people on the ground at the Fed. The people on the ground at the Fed were very open to the discussion. We had months of work with them in the it's now public information because they disclosed it. They disclosed an incredible amount of information they normally wouldn't disclose about an applicant. The denial order on Custodia is 41 times the longest ever Fed denial. Okay, so they disclose all kinds of non-public information that normally isn't disclosed. But so you can discern that we did a lot of work. There was an incredible amount of work. And it was not, from what I can tell, the people on the ground. It was the higher ups in Washington, D.C., going all the way up to the White House. And again, we have evidence of this. Some of this will come out later, that there was coordination and it was part of this all-of-government approach. So now what? Back to your question, where's this going to go? You asked about the CBDC. I actually think there's a decent chance that at first, when people said, did you get shot because of a CBDC? And I was scratching my head saying, I don't have evidence of that. I mean, is it possible? Yes, I suppose. I mean, I know some of the people in senior positions of power in the Biden administration are very pro CBDC, but why would the Fed go along with that? I didn't have evidence of it. But what has happened in this all-of-government approach that I just talked about, boy, they're really going after everybody who might be, basically they're clearing the runway for themselves, right? So, but this is part of the reason why it's so important that Custodia is fighting. Because if that's the case, keep in mind, I mentioned that Custodia has a patent. And one of the interesting things, it was granted in July, by the way, of last year, so it's coming up on the 1-year anniversary. One of the interesting questions about the structure of the Federal Reserve, as you guys probably know, is that it's owned by its members. Okay, it's owned by the banks. Why was the former CEO of Silicon Valley Bank on the board of the San Francisco Fed, which was its regulator? Okay, that was a question that a lot of people were asking. Okay, now the importance of that in the context of Custodia having been granted the patent, is that those are private entities. The 12 Federal Reserve banks are corporations. They're technically nonprofit corporations owned by their member banks. Okay, so do they have to comply with a private company's patent? I'm asking the question rhetorically. And so this is why people came to us early on and they said, it's because of the fact that you were going to issue a digital dollar and you had the patent that they had to try to shove you to the side. Well, if that's true, eventually that'll become pretty clear. I don't know if it's true. I don't have evidence of it. But to the point of your question, how's this going to go? Look, I think of the Biden administration. If Biden gets reelected, he's going to do it. That's my guess. Look at who's in charge of the National Economic Council. It's someone who has publicly supported a central bank digital currency.
I think it's interesting, especially, saying how outdated all the banking is. And then it's like, we just go right to CBDC. It's kind of wild.
Well, you're getting at why, I laugh at all this, right? Because, there was just a podcast last week at the American Bar Association Business Council about the innovation guardrails in the banking industry, and they had somebody at the Fed. Well, guess what the background of the person who gave the presentation was? Take a wild guess. What would you guess the background of the person who was telling the world what the innovation guidelines at the Fed are?
I don't know, something in...
A lawyer.
Yeah.
Okay. Remember
hardcore regulation.
Yeah. It was crystal clear this person didn't understand the technology. Okay. Do you really want lawyers writing technology policy? So, but that's kind of the point, right? Like, if there's... Part of me looks at that and thinks, I don't think there's any chance that a CBDC is going to get rolled out in the short term, because there's... Again,
too much of a gap.
Institutionally, there's a huge gap. Yeah.
So I guess I want to be cognizant of your time here too. Last question is, Bitcoin, obviously, most Bitcoiners think that it's like all or nothing. And obviously, you're kind of in the world of coexisting. And I'm curious, how do you see that coexist, these worlds coexisting in general? And is that you're saying that's a good thing? How do we increase adoption of Bitcoin with this threatening, oversight of the government and, all this uncertainty? And how do you sell this to Bitcoiners who are kind of like all or nothing?
Well, people find Bitcoin when it's the right time in their lives for people to find Bitcoin. And so part of what I was alluding to earlier with this whole idea of shoving crypto offshore, and where literally the people in charge at the very top have this mindset that it's all a Ponzi scheme and it's going to zero, and let's pop the bubble and make it go to zero. When it doesn't go to zero, which it has not and will not, in my opinion, then they're going to have to come to terms with the fact that what they did actually caused their problems to get a lot bigger, because now they're playing whack-a-mole. So I think eventually they're going to have to come to the table, and those of us who are fighting are, we're here. We're not giving up and won't give up. And what they're doing is unlawful in a lot of cases. And, we're playing it out. So, but the point is, the more that they try to ban something, the irony is that most people will be more interested in learning about why it is that the powers that be want to ban this. Right. And boy, I had a really interesting conversation with somebody who was a very experienced, very successful, respected investor who I've known for years. And he said, I don't have a sense where the US is going. I don't have a sense where markets are going. Usually you can kind of tell the direction. There's incredible upheaval and incredible uncertainty right now. I have no idea who's going to be the next president of the United States. I have no idea who the nominees of either party is going to be. Okay. It was not in my bingo card that RFK Jr. was going to come up and, with an anti-war, pro-Bitcoin, pro-free speech message.
Anti-vax. Yeah.
Wow. But look at what has happened in the polls, and look at some of these really interesting mainstream Democrats who have come up, and by the way, I'm seeing that on the Republican side as well. Folks who used to support Trump, who are looking for an alternative. And, it is a fact that Trump has been indicted, whether you agree with it or not, whether you think it was politically motivated. A majority of Americans, according to a Harvard poll I saw today, do think it's politically motivated. And, non-Americans must be looking at what's going on in the U.S. right now and thinking, are you kidding me? This is supposedly the leader of the world? It's nuts. It's just nuts. But the point is, I have no idea. None of us knows what's going to happen in the next 18 months. None of us. Except there's one thing I do know. There's a Bitcoin halving happening.
And every 10 minutes. Every
10 minutes, Bitcoin's going to keep pending a block, and there's a Bitcoin halving happening. It's going to be an interesting time, because if there's a Bitcoin bull market, which passed as prologue, and there are fundamental reasons to believe it will be, then, we're going to be in a big Bitcoin rally right into the U.S. presidential election. That's going to be interesting. And will the Biden administration have started to realize that turning off the Gen Z and millennial vote is not in their interest, and that the octogenarians who have decided that that's a good idea might not be appealing to the millennials and Gen Zs anymore? I don't know.
Yeah, it's fascinating. But fundamentally, you don't think the dollar has to go to zero for Bitcoin to succeed, right?
No, and I don't want to live in that world.
I
really don't.
That's important.
This is a hyper-Bitcoinization scenario that if let's have the dollar collapse tomorrow. I don't want to live in that world. I don't think any of us wants to live in that world. And because then we are, foraging. Then the hunting skills that we have, the city folk might wish they had. But yeah, I think it's at least a 20-year transition. Yeah, and one of the OG Bitcoiners that kind of dropped off the public facing side of the Bitcoin world. I had a conversation with him recently, and he said, it's happening about as fast as I expected that it would. He didn't think it was going to happen overnight either. And so I consider myself a long-term maxi, but I'm not a toxic maxi in the sense that I do believe Bitcoin's going to win out, but it has to win out against all of its adversaries. And the process of winning out against the adversaries strengthens it. So I welcome all of the attacks on it, because so far nothing has been able to really land a blow. And the U.S. government, trying to shove all the service providers offshore, that's not going to stop Bitcoin either.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I totally agree. We talk a lot about having a positive outlook. I think we want these things to happen slow and kind of more naturally, because hyper Bitcoinization or just the whole world imploding, no one wants to live in that scenario. And, hey, what are we all about here, people? Is low time preference. We want these things to kind of evolve.
Well, the counter argument, though, should. Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but this is important because the counter argument is worth understanding. It's that we are destroying our capital base every day that malinvestment is allowed to continue. So I respect and understand that those who say just stop and literally not have any any more intervention and like we talked about the Depression of 1920 that nobody talks about because it was only 9 months old, 9 months in duration. Let markets self-correct. I understand that view, and so that's why I wanted to give a head nod to if you were looking back in history and with the benefit of hindsight at today, you would say they should just let it all burn. However, people who have to live through that, it's not fun. It was not fun living through the Depression of 1920. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people lost their businesses. A lot of people lost their homes. A lot of people lost their livelihoods. And that's not fun. And so we can look back at it and say, oh yeah, great. Markets were left to self-correct. If you're living through it and you have to live through the social breakdown of that kind of environment, you don't wish that on even your worst enemies. So that's why I'm with Safety, and I think this system that we know is unstable will more likely die with a whimper than a bang as people just vote with their feet to the better system. But here's the great irony. Because the U.S. federal regulators are so afraid of crypto, they're making decisions out of fear. Organizations that make decisions out of fear tend to get what they feared. Okay, so all they're doing by trying to push us back to an analog world in the banking space, folks like you are probably not going to start lining up at a bank branch and filling out a withdrawal slip in handwriting. Okay, you're not going to go back to the bad user experience once you've known the good user experience of how fast money can move around the world. And you're going to just migrate with your feet that way. It's the same reason why the taxi and limousine commissions in the big cities were not able to stop Uber. The experience was so much better for the ultimate users, and they voted with their feet. And that's going to happen here with digital assets, in particular Bitcoin and Lightning Network, I think.
Yeah. I mean, we talk a lot about the power of the consumer, a lot from the food perspective, but I think that resonates here as well. So thank you so much, Caitlin.
Boy, we talked about a lot.
Yeah, no, this is fun. I really appreciate your perspective in the space too. I think it's refreshing, and it's important to have the open-mindedness of considering the alternative and coexisting of things. And obviously all the work you're doing with the banking side is so important. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's nice to meet you in person. We've interacted on Twitter. It's nice to see other Bitcoiners that moved to Wyoming and are building fun and interesting things. It is, and it's a wonderful place. But as the old bumper sticker says, stay away. Wyoming is full.
It's fake, actually. It doesn't even exist.
Right. Yeah, the old Garfield cartoon. Wyoming. What was it? I forgot the cartoon was. Yes, it's an Italian word for no state here.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much. And thank you, everyone.
So nice to see you guys in person. Thanks for coming to Cheyenne. Thanks.
Of course.